on the News Channel 5 network. This is OpenLine.
Hello everyone, welcome to OpenLine. So what did you think about last night's election? Tonight, we want to hear from you. What are your thoughts? Why did so many people turn out to vote? Why did Bill Lee and Marsha Blackburn win by such large margins? What about the Community Oversight Board? What are your thoughts on all of this and where we go from here? Happy to have with us David Plazas, Tennessean opinion and engagement editor. David, thank you for being here.
Thanks so much, Ben. I appreciate being here.
Well, I appreciate having you on. And what are some of your initial thoughts after last night? What are some of the things I guess you're following and some of your initial thoughts?
Sure. When it came to the gubernatorial race, we weren't surprised by the outcome. A lot of the polls were showing double-digit leads, so the Bill Lee victory was not so surprising. The one that was surprising was the margin between Marsha Blackburn and Phil Bredesen, given that the polls were all over the place, although for the last month at least, Congressman Blackburn had the advantage over time. What was interesting is to see that the two Democrats, Mr. Bredesen and Mr. Dean, only had 3 counties in Tennessee, which were Davidson, Haywood, and Shelby counties.
So Bredesen won. He only won 3 counties?
Yes. So
Bredesen only won 3 counties, and here he won every county the last time he ran. Now he was an incumbent governor.
That's right. That was in 2006. It's a different time. George W. Bush was president at that time. Certainly Governor Bredesen is a Democrat, was a moderate, maybe to conservative Democrat, and it was a time when the Democrats had control in the legislature, and so it was definitely not the Trump era that we have today. And if we look at the map itself, a lot of the areas that went red went really red, especially in East Tennessee, and also Davidson County went really blue. We decided here in Nashville to go far, far blue. So if you look at the numbers for both Phil Bredesen and Carl Dean, they're super majorities from Davidson County that voted for them, but it wasn't enough to overcome the obstacles in the rest of Tennessee.
Which is why there might be people here in Davidson County who were really shocked by the numbers, because Davidson County, I saw the early voting numbers, and for Bredesen, they were through the roof. I think he won by a 3-to-1 margin. Yes. I don't know how it finished out. Carl Dean won by a very large margin as well here in Davidson County. But then you get outside of Davidson County and they're losing by very large margins.
Absolutely. It should be said, though, the donut counties surrounding Davidson County were leaning red. They weren't hard red like some of the East Tennessee counties. One of the positive factors was the voter turnout. This is the best voter turnout in a midterm election in Tennessee since we have the data available since 1994. So we had more than 2.2 million people vote. About 58% of them had voted early, so that was about 1.3 million, which was spectacular. We were hoping for even more than that. We were 300,000 short from beating the 2016 number, but it's still really impressive given that since 2006 we saw a downward cycle of voter turnout in midterms. And
again, as far as the gubernatorial race, for Carl Dean, you see his message on election day coming from social media. You know, this huge turnout is going to be good news for us, and yet he didn't do much better than McWhorter did 8 years ago. And I thought I saw numbers, maybe it was 36% versus 32%. I think Carl Dean had 36% of the vote. Maybe McWhorter had 32%. Don't quote me exactly on that, but we're talking about pretty low numbers.
Yes.
And you know, Democrats thought they had a really strong candidate here.
No, and Carl Dean is a very strong candidate, but at this time, in this age, for this moment, Bill Lee was the stronger one. And interestingly, in the governor's race at least, he proved that his positive message of I'm an outsider, I'm a businessman, I'm a man of faith, would win. And it certainly got him 37% of the primary vote and then a supermajority in the general election vote. For Phil Bredesen, he wanted to maintain that statesman, civil type of approach to politics, and he was against a fighter. Congressman Blackburn was really tough, and many of the ads, which whether from her personally or from some outside group, were really aggressive, especially on hot-button issues like immigration or even the issue of sexual harassment. There was an array of commercials over the last several weeks from the time of the Brett Kavanaugh hearings in which there were actresses who were basically saying that that Phil Bredesen had allowed and enabled this culture of sexual harassment in when he was governor, which we know that there are incidents, but I'm not aware of any enabling of this.
No, I'm not either, but those commercials are running all the time, and they must have been effective. I would think the single biggest issue was Brett Kavanaugh. it seems to me like that's when the momentum really shifted.
I think you're right, because before that it was pretty close, and Brett Kavanaugh, according to polling, was very popular here in Tennessee. And it also affected the outcome of many other states where senators lost their seats, be it in North Dakota or in Montana, for example, where Kavanaugh was very popular. Interestingly, Joe Manchin, the only Democrat to vote for Kavanaugh in West Virginia, he kept his seat.
So no doubt that had some sort of impact. I was looking on Twitter. Joey Garrison tweeted something that the sheriff tweeted out. He's saying they need to overhaul the Democratic Party. I bet if they were to keep losing, they would fire the coach and change our offense. Our party needs to change our message. We can't continue to be the victim. That's from Sheriff Darren Hall. Our party needs to change our message. We can't continue to be the victim.
Well, this is the first time in several decades that there hasn't been a transition from one party to the other in the governor's seat. It used to be that it went from Republican to Democrat, Republican to Democrat, and this is from Haslam to Lee, it's Republican to Republican. There hasn't been a Democratic governor, of course, since Phil Bredesen, and so I think what the sheriff is saying, he being one of the highest-ranking Democrats in the county and in the state, makes sense. I mean, obviously, Democrats don't want to keep losing elections. Now, the difference is that they had top-tier candidates in both the Senate and the gubernatorial race, but it wasn't enough. And it may be partly that we are not as moderate a state as we used to be. You know, could Bob Corker have been elected this year? That's a good question. You know, he got into it with the president every so often, and it was very interesting to hear the rhetoric. I saw Senator Corker last week at a luncheon, and when he was asked about the institutions and President Trump's tweets, he said, look, things are working, they're fine, we get into it sometimes, but let's not get into the fear-mongering. He was actually very critical of the fear-mongering surrounding the migrant caravan, which is coming from south of the border. It's about 25 to 2,900 miles away from Nashville, so it's still quite a way, and it's not an invading army. But that kind of rhetoric was very effective.
And that's a great point. Another commercial we saw over and over was that caravan commercial. I'd be interested to hear from people how much did that play into your vote? Was it immigration? You know, kind of what was on your mind? We'll go to the phones now. Let's go to Linda. Is it right? Is that Linda? Linda, go right ahead.
Yes, I just wanted to make a comment. The governor's race didn't bother me as much. I think Carl Dean would have been better because he has some experience in government. But that Blackburn getting elected, that is so disgusting. All she'll do is sit up there, collect more money from drug companies, and go along with anything Trump says. So, not happy with that at all.
So it sounds like, are you a Democrat?
Well, I wasn't until Trump came in, and then I switched over.
Okay.
I've always voted Republican until Trump.
And where are you calling from?
Nashville.
So Davidson County.
Yes.
All right, thank you. Thanks for that opinion.
Well, it's really interesting. Aside from Brett Kavanaugh, some messages that Congressman Blackburn, now Senator-elect Blackburn, was relaying was, I'm going to repeal Obamacare, and at the same time talking about the issue of building the wall. I'm going to build the wall. She said that yesterday in her victory speech. Interesting, with a divided Congress now, the House is now will be in Democratic hands. It's possible she may not be able to live up to those promises. If the House decides to block some things from the president, that wall will not be built at least in the next 2 years, and Obamacare will stay as it is.
I wonder how effective, and I might help answer this question, how effective do you think it was to have President Trump come to Tennessee and campaign on her behalf? Oh,
extremely. She won. Yeah. I think it was extremely effective, and where he chose to go to, he was very successful. Now, at the same time, he lost the House, which meant that that's actually a failure from his part. He said that this was all successful to him, and in fact, the Senate has a greater majority of Republicans than it did before. The House is Democratic, which in many ways is healthy for democracy to have divided government like that. But in other states like Indiana, that flipped red, or I mentioned already North Dakota, and other states where you saw that kind of trajectory.
Let's go to Ann. Hello, Ann.
Good evening. One race or amendment that negative ads and or negative push that did not affect the race was Amendment 1. Voters turned out and this was passed. And today, it's been an outpouring of high-ranking officials stating that, one, they always either endorse a community oversight board, or two, they are now on board and will do everything they can do to see a community oversight board successfully pass through. So throughout this entire process, I found one individual to be accurate and thorough in his printed words and his research, and that would be your panelist. So I would like to hear his input on today and the election process. And I'll just say thanks and have a good evening.
Thank you, Ann. Appreciate it.
That's from Ann.
No, thank you very much. Yes, I'd researched this issue looking back at Tennessean archives and other materials about community oversight, and actually there's been a call for it for at least 40 years. There was a similar shooting to the Daniel Hambrick shooting, which occurred over the summer, eerily similar, and in the same neighborhood in the early 1970s with a Tennessee State University student, and from that time there were calls for more oversight of police, a community oversight board. And this is an issue that's been controversial across the country, yet momentum really built, and it won with about 58% of the vote here in Davidson County. The ads were pretty hard. They were using the theme that you were going to have a $10 million tax increase, essentially, which I don't know where that came from. And obviously, there is a figure in the charter amendment language, which is $1.5 million minimum every single year, and there's staff involved and so forth. The Mayor Briley has said he's not interested in raising taxes, so he's going to have to find the money somehow. And he stated yesterday in a press release that he had been for oversight. He had not been for this amendment, and his rationale, which is actually from his position, I get where he's coming from. He didn't want to do budget allocations via the charter. And so, because it can be very difficult, especially if you have a tough year, and he's had a tough budget year this past year, but he said that he was always for community oversight itself, and now I think it's a good news that he's saying the people have spoken and he's going to implement it. So he's got to implement it by the beginning of next year.
By the beginning of next year. Were you surprised? This was one, I wasn't sure how it was going to go. There was a well-funded opposition, there's no doubt. We saw commercials, and the one you mentioned, so there were commercials on the air opposed to it. Obviously a lot of passion really on both sides. So were you surprised how this went, or what did you think as the numbers came in?
Yeah, I wasn't sure where this was going to go. When I did my own analysis and as an opinion columnist came out with a position, I explained why I voted for it. And a lot of it was because of the concerns over oversight and trust issues that came with police. But there's always the concern, and it was addressed actually in a recent op-ed by Rashida Fatuga, who is part of the Gideon's Army, the founder of that, basically says that you can still love police and also want community oversight. And the whole point of it was initially trying to be set against the people, mainly African-American activists, and the police, but it really wasn't that. And I'm very happy that it went the way it did. And there were a lot of people who were not just necessarily activists, from authors to attorneys to others, who were very actively in support of this because they felt it was the right thing to do, because there had been these issues of feelings of lack of trust.
Well, let's go to Wayne. Hello, Wayne. Are you there? Wayne,
yes,
hello. Hello. Go right ahead. Go right ahead.
Yeah, what I wanted to ask was, after last night, you see the results. I mean, it was interesting to watch Channel 5, cover the election, and the team that you had were very informed, but it was like an hour after the polls closed, it was decided. But every other channel, they couldn't make up their mind. They kept saying, well, we can't call it, it's too close. And I'm saying, it's interesting that your channel was so informed that y'all could call the election an hour after the polls closed, and everybody else just kept putting it off because they didn't want to decide. And I want to ask you this. Do you think now is the time for a third party in this country? Because the people that didn't want to vote Democrat or Republican are the new third party. And I'm just wondering, what are we waiting for?
Is now the time for a third party? We can talk a little bit about that. I appreciate what you're saying about the coverage. What we did was we I did. I was tweeting out essentially and saying what CBS News was saying. CBS News was very quick to call some of these races. The AP called the gubernatorial race very quickly. I think more quickly than even we did. Now on the local level, we have people at every precinct site, and they call back here. I posted a picture of a bunch of people here taking phone calls, and that's how we get on the local level in Davidson County some numbers in. But as far as calling the race, that was more, we were reporting what others were doing. The AP called it, or CBS News called it. And they called these races more quickly than I think we were prepared to call it. And certainly some of those campaigns, but they have all kinds of data, and that's how they made that decision.
You know, it's a tough thing because we received some complaints from readers who were upset that results were out before some people had finished voting. So
which seems wrong. I don't blame them.
Yeah, so for example, in Antioch High School yesterday, people were waiting as long as 2 hours just to vote, which is, it's great to see that enthusiasm, but at the same time, people would have this feeling that, my goodness, does my vote count at this point? I remember in 2012, I actually lived in Florida at the time, and people were in line for 6 hours. And many of them were in line, you know, still when the results of the presidential election were released.
And that does make you question, how does your vote count when they're already releasing the results and you still haven't voted? I understand that. We were concerned at the station. Again, what was happening was there were some national outlets and others that were calling these races, and we did report some of that. Now, the most interesting was Davidson County wasn't releasing early voting numbers until 8 o'clock. They might have even been later than that because they wanted everyone to vote.
Yes.
And certainly in these local elections, those early voting numbers are critical. We're not going to do anything until we get that. But on the statewide level, yeah, the AP called it. I believe CBS News called it. It was called pretty quickly.
When we look at population counts, for example, Davidson County, there are over 650,000 people, which is about 10% of the state population. So it only proportional will only go benefit one particular candidate, the Democrats, in a certain way. And that's why, as Democrats look into the future, if maybe if Sheriff Hall is part of that, they can look at what's the strategy to go beyond just the main two counties that vote Democratic, Shelby and also Davidson County, but also Haywood and many others. Rural areas went firmly for the Republicans, for Senator-elect Blackburn and Governor-elect Lee. And
the other part of his question, a third party. I don't know about a third party. Certainly, when you hear Darren Hall, Democratic sheriff here in Davidson County, saying the party needs to reevaluate what it's doing, come up with a new message, it maybe needs to reinvent itself. I don't know about a third party, but to that question, what do you say?
Sure, and we've seen many efforts to create one. Certainly in the 1990s, Ross Perot was behind a drive he had run in 1992, 1996. We've seen other people, you know, in minor ways be successful, like Jesse Ventura in Minnesota, the former world wrestler. But at the same time, still, we're very much a two-party system. And we're a two-party system thanks to Martin Van Buren, thanks to many others, and who was Andrew Jackson's vice president and later president himself. And we have a system that we've continued to perpetuate. Interestingly enough, here in Tennessee, when you go to vote, you don't have to declare your party affiliation during a primary, for example. You could be ideologically Republican and vote in the Democratic primary and vice versa, but that's our system here. Many other states have closed primaries, others have open, but when it comes to the voting system, there have been criticisms, because we saw, for example, for the last two election cycles, Tennessee ranked 50th and 49th in voter turnout. It'll be very interesting to see what the results are for the 2018 election. I'm sure that we've grown quite a bit, because we saw tremendous increase. We saw essentially 58% increase from the last midterm election, which is phenomenal.
Good grief, that is an enormous increase. Okay. We have to take a break. Billy and others, hold on the line. If you want to call in, there's the number, 615-737-PLUS. 615-737-7587. What did you think about the election last night? What were the motivating factors for what happened? We'll take a break. Be back right after this.